The morning sun cast long shadows across the training compound as Lieutenant Sarah Martinez adjusted her tactical gear one final time. Her hands moved with practiced precision, checking each piece of equipment that could mean the difference between life and death in the mission ahead. The weight of her rifle felt familiar against her shoulder, a comfort she had grown to depend on during her 5 years as one of the few women to earn the Navy SEAL Trident. Sarah's squad received their briefing in a windowless room that smelled of coffee and determination. Intelligence reports indicated a high-value target hiding in a remote compound, nestled deep within enemy territory. The mission seemed straightforward on paper, but Sarah's instincts told her otherwise. She had learned to trust those instincts during countless operations that had earned her the respect of her male counterparts and the unwavering loyalty of her team. The helicopter ride to the insertion point passed in tense silence. Sarah studied the terrain maps one more time, memorizing every ridge, every possible escape route, and every potential danger zone. Her team members sat quietly around her, each lost in their own pre-mission rituals. These men had become her brothers through shared hardship and mutual trust, built in the crucible of combat. As they approached the drop zone, the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets with an urgent warning. Enemy radar had detected their approach earlier than expected. The mission timeline compressed from hours to minutes as hostile forces mobilized in the valley below. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but her training kicked in automatically, suppressing fear and focusing her mind on the task ahead. The fast rope insertion went smoothly despite the compromised approach. Sarah's boots hit the rocky ground with practiced silence, and her team quickly formed a defensive perimeter. The compound lay 2 kilometers ahead through terrain that offered little cover, but plenty of opportunities for ambush. Every shadow could hide an enemy fighter. Every rock formation could conceal a sniper's nest. Moving through the darkness, Sarah's team advanced with the fluid coordination that only comes from years of training together. They communicated through hand signals and shared glances, each member anticipating the other's movements. The weight of their mission pressed down on them like the thin mountain air, but they pushed forward with the determination that defined their brotherhood. The first sign of trouble came from their point man, who held up a closed fist signaling immediate danger ahead. Through her night vision goggles, Sarah spotted the telltale heat signatures of enemy sentries positioned along their planned route. The tactical situation required a quick decision, and Sarah's mind raced through the available options while time ticked away precious seconds. Without hesitation, she signaled for an alternate approach that would take them through more dangerous terrain, but avoid the enemy positions. Her team trusted her judgment completely, following her lead as they adjusted their route toward the compound. The mission's success depended on reaching their target before enemy reinforcements could arrive and trap them in hostile territory. As they crested a small ridge overlooking their objective, Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded combat operations. The compound below buzzed with activity as enemy forces prepared for the battle they knew was coming. Her team had trained for scenarios exactly like this one, but training never fully prepared anyone for the chaos and unpredictability of actual combat. The radio crackled with updates from their command center, confirming that enemy reinforcements were indeed moving toward their position. Sarah's team had a narrow window of opportunity to complete their mission and extract before being overwhelmed by superior numbers. She checked her watch and calculated the time remaining before their extraction helicopter would arrive at the designated landing zone. Looking at her teammates' faces, Sarah saw the same determination she felt burning in her own chest. They had come too far and sacrificed too much to turn back now. The mission would continue as planned, regardless of the increased danger they faced. Her finger traced the SEAL Trident on her uniform, a reminder of the oath she had taken and the standards she was sworn to uphold. The compound's lights created an island of illumination in the surrounding darkness, making their approach more challenging but also providing clear visibility of their target. Sarah's training had taught her to find opportunity in every obstacle, and she quickly identified several potential advantages in the current tactical situation. Her team waited for her signal, ready to follow her into whatever lay ahead. Sarah took a deep breath of the cold mountain air and prepared to lead her team into combat. The weight of command settled on her shoulders like familiar armor, bringing with it both burden and strength. Every decision she made in the next few hours would determine not only the mission's success, but also whether her team would return home safely. The enemy compound lay before them like a fortress. But Sarah had never met a fortress that couldn't be conquered with proper planning and flawless execution. Her team was ready, their equipment was checked, and their resolve was unshakable. The time for preparation had ended, and the time for action had begun. Sarah signaled to her team, and they began their final approach toward the compound that would test everything they had learned and everything they had become. The compound's perimeter defenses proved more sophisticated than their intelligence had suggested. Sarah watched through her scope as enemy patrols moved in coordinated patterns around the facility, their movements suggesting professional military training rather than the ragtag militia they had expected to encounter. She whispered tactical adjustments to her team, adapting their assault plan to the reality they faced on the ground. Moving like shadows through the rocky terrain, Sarah's team approached the compound's eastern wall, where their reconnaissance had identified the weakest point in the defenses. The smell of diesel fuel and cooking fires drifted on the night breeze, mixing with the sharp scent of mountain sage. Every sense remained heightened as they closed the distance to their target, knowing that detection now would mean certain death. The breach went exactly as planned, with Sarah's demolitions expert creating a small opening in the compound wall that would appear accidental to casual observation. They slipped through the gap one by one, moving with the precision of a surgical strike team. Inside the compound, shadows provided cover as they advanced toward the main building where their target was believed to be hiding. Sarah's heart pounded steadily as they navigated between storage buildings and equipment sheds, each step bringing them closer to their objective. Her team moved in perfect synchronization, covering each other's movements and maintaining constant communication through subtle hand signals. The years of training and combat experience had forged them into a weapon more deadly than any individual soldier could ever be. The main building loomed before them, a concrete structure that seemed to absorb the surrounding darkness. Intelligence reports indicated their target occupied the second floor, but Sarah's tactical instincts warned her that the situation felt too easy. Enemy forces had positioned themselves strategically throughout the compound, suggesting they knew exactly what was coming and when. As they approached the building's entrance, the sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the night silence. One of Sarah's teammates stumbled and fell, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. The mission had been compromised and enemy forces emerged from concealed positions throughout the compound. Sarah's training took over as she immediately began coordinating her team's response to the ambush. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions, forcing Sarah's team to take cover behind a concrete barrier near the main building. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireworks, and the air filled with the whine of bullets passing overhead. Sarah assessed their tactical situation quickly, recognizing that they were outnumbered and outgunned in an increasingly desperate fight for survival. Radio communications with their command center had been jammed, cutting them off from air support and extraction coordination. Sarah's team was trapped inside the compound with wounded teammates and diminishing ammunition supplies. The mission to capture their high-value target had transformed into a fight for survival against overwhelming odds in hostile territory. Enemy forces began advancing on their position with disciplined fire and movement tactics that confirmed Sarah's suspicion about their professional training. She directed her team's defensive fire while simultaneously planning their escape route from the compound. The wounded teammate continued fighting despite his injury, refusing to become a liability that would compromise the team's survival. Grenades began exploding around their position, filling the air with concrete dust and metal fragments. Sarah felt sharp pain as shrapnel cut across her left arm, but she ignored the wound and continued coordinating her team's resistance. They had trained for exactly this type of scenario, but the reality of combat always proved more chaotic and unforgiving than any training exercise. The enemy's superior numbers began telling as they established overlapping fields of fire that made movement increasingly dangerous. Sarah's ammunition was running low, and she could see the same concern reflected in her teammates' faces. They needed to break out of the compound soon or risk being overwhelmed by the steadily tightening enemy assault. Crying spotted a possible escape route through a gap between two storage buildings that would lead them toward the compound's northern wall. The route would require crossing 30 meters of open ground under enemy fire, but staying in their current position meant certain death or capture. She gathered her team and explained the plan, watching as each man nodded his understanding. and acceptance of the risks involved. The suppressing fire from her teammates provided cover as Sarah led the desperate dash across the open compound toward their escape route. Bullets struck the ground around her feet and whined past her head as she ran, but her focus remained fixed on reaching the cover of the storage buildings. Behind her, she could hear her teammates following, their boots pounding against the hard-packed earth. An explosion to her left knocked Sarah sideways, and she felt something heavy strike the back of her head. The world spun around her as she struggled to maintain consciousness, tasting blood in her mouth and feeling warm liquid running down her neck. Through blurred vision, she watched her teammates continue toward the storage buildings while enemy forces closed in on her position. Sarah tried to stand but found her legs wouldn't respond properly to her commands. The explosion had damaged something important, and she could feel herself growing weaker with each passing second. Her rifle lay just beyond reach, and enemy soldiers were advancing toward her position with weapons raised and ready to fire. Darkness crept in around the edges of her vision as Sarah fought to stay conscious. She could hear her teammates calling her name from somewhere that seemed very far away, but their voices were growing fainter. The last thing she remembered before unconsciousness claimed her was the feeling of rough hands grabbing her arms and dragging her across the rocky ground toward an uncertain fate. Consciousness returned slowly, bringing with it waves of pain that seemed to originate from every part of Sarah's body. Her head throbbed with the intensity that made thinking difficult, and the metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. When she tried to move, she discovered that her hands were bound tightly behind her back with rough rope that had already begun cutting into her wrists. The darkness around her was complete, suggesting she was being held in some kind of underground facility or basement room. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, with underlying odors that she preferred not to identify. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the muffled sounds of voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize, though their tone suggested urgency and anger. Sarah's training had included extensive preparation for capture and interrogation scenarios, but the reality felt far more intimidating than any classroom exercise. She forced herself to remain calm and began systematically testing her bonds, while trying to gather information about her surroundings. The rope binding her wrists was tight but not impossible to work against given enough time and patience. Her tactical vest and equipment had been removed, leaving her in just her uniform and boots. The absence of her weapon felt like losing a limb, but Sarah knew that her most important tool was her mind, and the determination that had carried her through SEAL training. She began working on loosening the ropes while listening carefully to the sounds around her, for any indication of guard positions or patrol schedules. The wound on her head had stopped bleeding, but dried blood had matted her hair and made movement painful. Sarah suspected she had suffered a concussion during the explosion, which explained the persistent dizziness and occasional double vision. Despite these handicaps, her resolve remained unshaken, and she began planning her escape from whatever prison they had placed her in. Footsteps echoed from somewhere above her, growing closer with each passing moment. Sarah quickly stopped working on her bonds and assumed the position they would expect from an unconscious prisoner. The sound of a heavy door opening was followed by harsh light that stabbed into her eyes like needles, forcing her to squint against the sudden brightness. 3 men descended a crude wooden staircase, their boots making hollow sounds against the planks. The leader carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command, while his companions seemed more like hired muscle than professional soldiers. They spoke in rapid bursts of conversation that Sarah couldn't understand, but their gestures and expressions made their intentions clear enough. The interrogation began immediately, with questions shouted in broken English about her mission details and team composition. Sarah responded with only her name, rank, and service number as her training dictated, refusing to provide any information that could compromise her teammates or future operations. Each refusal brought increasingly violent responses from her captors, but she endured their anger without breaking. Hours passed in a cycle of questions, threats, and punishment that tested every aspect of Sarah's mental and physical endurance. Her captors seemed frustrated by her resistance, their methods becoming more desperate and unpredictable as time wore on. She used their emotional state against them, observing their behavior patterns and identifying weaknesses she might be able to exploit. During a break in the interrogation, Sarah was left alone in the underground room while her captors argued loudly somewhere above her. She immediately resumed working on her bonds, using the wall behind her to create leverage against the ropes. Progress was slow and painful, but she could feel the rope beginning to stretch and loosen with each careful movement. The sound of vehicles arriving outside interrupted her escape efforts, and Sarah quickly resumed her helpless prisoner pose. New voices joined the conversation above, speaking with authority that suggested higher-ranking commanders had arrived. The tone of the discussion changed, becoming more urgent and organized as plans were apparently being made for her disposition. When her original captors returned, they were accompanied by a man wearing military fatigues who spoke English with only a slight accent. He introduced himself as a colonel and claimed that Sarah's teammates had abandoned her during their escape from the compound. His psychological tactics were more sophisticated than the crude violence she had endured earlier, but equally ineffective against her trained resistance. The colonel informed Sarah that she would be moved to a more secure facility where professional interrogators would extract the information they needed. He described in detail what those interrogations would involve, clearly hoping to break her resolve before the transfer took place. Sarah listened without showing emotion, filing away every piece of information that might prove useful during her escape attempt. As night fell outside, preparations began for Sarah's transfer to the new facility. Her captors gathered equipment and discussed routes while she pretended to sleep in her corner of the underground room. The ropes around her wrists had loosened enough that she could slip one hand free, but she waited for the right moment to make her move. The opportunity came when only one guard remained to watch her, while the others loaded vehicles outside. Sarah waited until he turned his attention to something happening upstairs, then slipped her bonds and moved silently across the room. Years of stealth training guided her movements as she approached the distracted guard from behind. The guard's unconscious body hit the floor with barely a sound, and Sarah quickly appropriated his weapon and equipment. She could hear the other captors returning, their voices growing closer as they descended toward the basement room. Sarah positioned herself beside the doorway, ready to fight her way to freedom against whatever odds awaited her. The first captor through the door never saw the attack coming, and Sarah was already moving toward the staircase before his body hit the ground. Shouts of alarm echoed from above as the remaining captors realized their prisoner had escaped. Sarah climbed toward the light filtering down from the main floor, knowing that the most dangerous part of her escape was just beginning. Sarah emerged from the basement into chaos as her captors scrambled to organize a response to her escape. The building appeared to be an abandoned farmhouse surrounded by rocky terrain that offered both challenges and opportunities for someone trying to evade pursuit. Through the grimy windows, she could see vehicle headlights moving in the distance, suggesting that additional enemy forces were converging on the location. Moving with the stealth that had become second nature during her years of special operations training, Sarah slipped through the farmhouse while avoiding the remaining captors who were shouting orders and running between rooms. The weapon she had taken from the guard provided some security, but ammunition was limited and noise would only attract more attention to her position. The back door of the farmhouse opened onto a yard filled with abandoned farm equipment and overgrown vegetation that provided excellent concealment. Sarah used the shadows to move away from the building, while the sounds of pursuit grew more organized behind her. Her captors had realized the scope of the situation and were beginning a systematic search of the area. Dogs began barking somewhere in the distance, their sounds carrying clearly through the cold night air. Sarah's stomach tightened as she recognized the distinctive baying of tracking animals, knowing that her scent trail would lead them directly to her position, unless she could find water or rocky ground to break the trail. The terrain around the farmhouse consisted mainly of soft earth that would hold footprints perfectly. Moving as quickly as silence would allow, Sarah worked her way across the yard toward a line of trees that might provide better concealment. Behind her, flashlight beams swept back and forth across the ground as her former captors expanded their search pattern. The barking of the dogs was getting closer, confirming her fears about their tracking capabilities. The tree line offered temporary relief from the open exposure of the farmyard, but Sarah knew she needed to find water or rocky terrain soon if she hoped to evade the tracking dogs. Her mental map of the area suggested a stream running through the valley about 2 kilometers to the north, but reaching it would require crossing open ground under the observation of her pursuers. Vehicles were moving along the roads surrounding the farmhouse, their headlights creating moving patterns of light that illuminated the landscape in unpredictable ways. Sarah counted at least 4 different engines, suggesting that her captors had called in significant reinforcements for the manhunt. The professional organization, of their response indicated military or paramilitary training rather than the amateur operation she had initially hoped to face. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed from somewhere overhead, adding an aerial component to the search that would make movement much more dangerous. Sarah pressed herself against a large tree trunk as the aircraft passed overhead, its spotlight sweeping back and forth across the forest canopy. The thermal imaging equipment that modern military helicopters carried would make her heat signature visible even through moderate cover radio chatter from her pursuers became audible as they established a communications network for coordinating the search. Sarah's knowledge of tactical Arabic allowed her to understand fragments of their conversations, confirming that they were indeed professional soldiers, rather than the militia fighters she had initially encountered. Their systematic approach to the manhunt suggested extensive experience with tracking escaped prisoners. Finding a small creek running through the forest floor, Sarah immediately waded into the cold water to break her scent trail and mask her thermal signature. The shock of the icy water against her injured body was intense, but she forced herself to move upstream against the current. Every step was painful, but the water would buy her precious time before the tracking dogs could pick up her trail again. The creek led her toward the valley where the larger stream was located, but progress was slow and exhausting. Sarah's head injury made balance difficult on the slippery rocks, and several times she nearly fell into deeper pools that would have soaked her completely. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit continued as her captors expanded their search pattern into the surrounding forest. After what felt like hours of struggling through the rocky creek bed, Sarah finally reached the main stream that ran through the valley floor. The water was deeper and faster moving, providing excellent concealment for her movements but also increasing the danger of being swept away by the current. She chose to follow the stream eastward, away from the roads where most of the vehicle activity was concentrated. The helicopter returned periodically, its searchlight probing the landscape in systematic patterns that forced Sarah to take cover under overhanging rocks and dense vegetation. Each time the aircraft passed overhead, she remained motionless until the sound of its rotors faded into the distance. The pilot was clearly experienced in search operations, varying his pattern to avoid becoming predictable. Dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky when Sarah finally allowed herself to rest beneath a rocky overhang that provided concealment from both ground and air observation. Her uniform was soaked and torn, her body was shivering from cold and exhaustion, but she had successfully evaded capture through the most dangerous hours of the manhunt. The immediate pursuit seemed to have moved away from her current position. Sarah used the brief respite to assess her tactical situation and plan her next moves. She was alone in enemy territory with limited weapons and no communication with friendly forces. Her injuries were slowing her down, and her captors would undoubtedly expand their search as daylight made tracking easier. The nearest friendly territory was probably more than 50 kilometers away, across mountainous terrain controlled by hostile forces. Despite the overwhelming odds against her, Sarah felt the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through SEAL training and countless combat operations. She had escaped from captivity against superior numbers, and now she needed to complete the journey home. Her training had prepared her for exactly this type of survival situation, and she intended to prove that SEALs never surrender quietly. The stream continued eastward through terrain that gradually became more rugged and defensible. Sarah gathered her remaining strength and prepared to continue her journey toward freedom, knowing that every mile she traveled away from her captors increased her chances of eventual rescue. The sun was rising on what would prove to be the most challenging day of her military career. The morning sun brought both opportunity and danger as Sarah continued her journey through the mountainous terrain toward what she hoped was friendly territory. Daylight made navigation easier, but also increased her visibility to the search teams that were undoubtedly still hunting for her throughout the region. She moved carefully from cover to cover, using the tactical movement techniques that had been drilled into her during years of special operations training. Her stomach cramped with hunger, and dehydration was becoming a serious concern despite her access to stream water. Sarah's survival training included extensive instruction on finding food in hostile environments, but foraging would require time and attention that she couldn't afford while being actively pursued. She forced herself to ignore the discomfort and focus on putting distance between herself and her captors. The terrain gradually became more rugged as Sarah climbed higher into the mountains, following animal trails and natural corridors that offered concealment from aerial observation. The thin air at altitude made breathing difficult, especially with her head injury. But the rocky landscape provided excellent defensive positions if she encountered pursuit teams on the ground. Around midday, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of helicopters approaching from the west, suggesting that her captors had expanded their search area significantly. She quickly found cover beneath a rocky outcropping and watched as 2 aircraft swept across the valley below, their crews obviously searching for any sign of her passage. The systematic nature of their search pattern indicated professional military training and unlimited resources. Radio intercepts that Sarah overheard during brief moments when aircraft passed nearby suggested that her escape had attracted attention from higher command levels. Additional units were being deployed to join the manhunt, and roadblocks were being established throughout the region. The scope of the response indicated that she was considered a high-value prisoner whose escape posed a significant threat to their operations. As afternoon wore on, Sarah encountered her first civilian since the escape began. A shepherd tending his flock in a remote mountain meadow spotted her moving through the rocks above his position. Their eyes met across the distance, and Sarah saw surprise and fear in his expression. She held her finger to her lips in a universal gesture for silence, hoping he would understand that her presence posed no threat to him or his animals. The shepherd watched her for several long moments before turning away and continuing with his work as if nothing had happened. Sarah couldn't be certain whether his apparent indifference indicated sympathy for her situation or simply a desire to avoid involvement in whatever conflict was taking place in his mountains. Either way, she was grateful that he hadn't immediately raised an alarm. Moving through a narrow canyon that offered excellent concealment but limited escape routes, Sarah discovered evidence that other people had recently passed through the area. Boot prints in the soft sand showed the distinctive tread patterns of military footwear, suggesting that pursuit teams were already operating ahead of her intended route. She would need to find an alternate path that avoided the obvious corridors through the mountains. The sound of gunfire echoing from somewhere behind her confirmed that her captors were still actively searching for her trail. Whether they were shooting at shadows or had encountered some other target was unclear, but the sustained nature of the engagement suggested a significant contact. Sarah used the distraction to move more quickly through an exposed section of terrain that would normally require careful stealth. Evening was approaching when Sarah finally spotted what appeared to be a small village nestled in a valley several kilometers ahead. Smoke rising from cooking fires indicated civilian occupation, but she couldn't determine whether the inhabitants were friendly or hostile without closer reconnaissance. The village represented both an opportunity for aid and a significant risk if the population was sympathetic to her captors. Her tactical situation was becoming increasingly desperate as darkness approached. Sarah's injuries were sapping her strength. Her ammunition was limited, and she had no way to contact friendly forces for extraction or support. The village ahead might be her only chance for finding food, medical supplies, or communication equipment that could help her complete her escape. Sarah spent the remaining daylight hours conducting careful observation of the village from concealed positions in the surrounding hills. She identified approximately 20 buildings arranged around a central square, with what appeared to be a small mosque and marketplace. The population seemed to consist mainly of families engaged in subsistence farming and herding, though she couldn't rule out the presence of armed fighters among the civilian population. As night fell, Sarah made her decision to approach the village carefully and attempt to make contact with someone who might be willing to help her. She had learned enough of the local language during her mission preparation to communicate basic needs, though complex negotiations would be difficult. The risk was enormous, but her alternatives were becoming more limited with each passing hour. Moving silently through the darkness toward the village perimeter, Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied high-risk operations. Everything she had learned during her military career had prepared her for this moment, when survival depended on split-second decisions and flawless execution. Her SEAL training had taught her that impossible situations were simply challenges that required creative solutions. The first building she approached appeared to be a storage shed for farming equipment, offering a good observation point for studying the village layout and identifying potential allies or threats. Through the windows of nearby houses, she could see families gathering for evening meals, their conversations creating a backdrop of normal life that seemed surreal after the violence and danger of the past few days. Sarah noticed that one house on the village outskirts appeared to be occupied by an elderly woman living alone. The building was isolated enough to provide concealment for an approach, and an older civilian might be less likely to have connections with military or paramilitary organizations. She decided to make her first contact attempt there, knowing that her fate might well depend on the woman's reaction to finding an armed foreign soldier at her door. Taking a deep breath of the cold mountain air, Sarah prepared to trust her life to the kindness of strangers. Her journey toward freedom was entering its most critical phase, where human compassion would prove more important than any weapon or tactical skill she possessed. The next few hours would determine whether she would complete her escape or face capture, and an uncertain fate in enemy hands. Sarah approached the isolated house with extreme caution, every sense alert for signs of danger or surveillance. The elderly woman inside was moving around her kitchen, preparing what appeared to be a simple evening meal. Light from oil lamps cast flickering shadows against the windows, creating an atmosphere of peaceful domesticity that seemed almost impossible after the violence and chaos of the past few days. The decision to trust a complete stranger with her life went against every tactical principle Sarah had learned during her military career, but desperation had left her with few alternatives. She circled the house carefully, confirming that no other people were present and identifying potential escape routes if the situation went wrong. Her weapon remained ready but concealed as she approached the front door. Sarah's gentle knock on the wooden door created a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet evening air. The movement inside the house stopped immediately, followed by the careful footsteps of someone approaching the door with obvious caution. A voice spoke in the local language, asking who was there and what they wanted at such a late hour. Using her limited vocabulary, Sarah identified herself as an injured traveler seeking help and shelter for the night. The door remained closed for several long moments while the woman apparently considered this request. When it finally opened, Sarah found herself face to face with a woman in her 70s whose eyes showed both kindness and the hardened wisdom that comes from surviving decades of conflict and disputed territory. The woman's reaction to seeing a foreign soldier at her door was carefully controlled, suggesting that such encounters were not entirely unprecedented in her experience. Without speaking, she gestured for Sarah to enter quickly and immediately moved to close and bar the door behind her. The interior of the house was simple but clean, with cooking smells that made Sarah's empty stomach clench with hunger. Communication proved challenging despite Sarah's language training, but the universal language of human compassion bridged most gaps in vocabulary. The woman immediately began treating Sarah's injuries with supplies from a well-stocked medical kit that suggested either professional training or extensive experience dealing with wounded people. Her gentle efficiency spoke of someone who had provided such care many times before. Hot food and clean water felt like luxuries beyond imagination after days of survival in hostile territory. Sarah ate slowly despite her hunger, maintaining awareness of her surroundings while the elderly woman bustled around the kitchen preparing additional supplies. The kindness of this stranger felt almost overwhelming after the brutality she had endured from her captors. The woman spoke quietly while working, and Sarah gradually understood that she was explaining the current situation in the region. Military forces were conducting extensive searches throughout the mountains, and several villages had been occupied by soldiers asking questions about foreign fighters. The manhunt for Sarah had apparently expanded far beyond anything she had imagined. As the evening progressed, the woman's motivations became clearer through fragments of conversation and observation of her behavior. Photographs on the wall showed family members in military uniforms from various conflicts spanning several decades. Sarah realized that this woman had probably lost sons or grandsons to the endless cycle of violence that plagued the region, yet she was still willing to help an enemy soldier in need. The sound of vehicles approaching the village in the distance sent both women to the windows, where they watched military trucks establishing positions around the settlement perimeter. Soldiers began moving from house to house, conducting what appeared to be a systematic search of every building. Sarah's time in the sanctuary of this humble home was about to end. One way or another, the elderly woman moved with surprising speed and determination, gathering supplies into a small backpack while gesturing for Sarah to prepare for immediate departure. A back door led to a small garden that connected to terraced hillsides behind the village, offering a potential escape route that would avoid the military cordon being established around the settlement. Before they parted, the woman pressed a small radio into Sarah's hands along with written instructions in broken English. explaining how to contact a network of people who help travelers reach safe territory. The existence of such an organization suggested that Sarah was not the first person to find herself in desperate need of assistance in these mountains. Their farewell was brief but meaningful, with the elderly woman touching Sarah's face gently while speaking words that needed no translation. The kindness and courage of this stranger had quite literally saved her life, and Sarah knew she would never forget the compassion shown by someone who had every reason to consider her an enemy. Moving through the darkness behind the village, Sarah could hear the soldiers conducting their search with increasing intensity. Doors were being forced open, and shouted questions echoed between the buildings as the manhunt reached a new level of urgency. Her brief respite was over, but she now had supplies, information, and most importantly, hope for reaching friendly territory. The radio the woman had given her crackled to life as Sarah reached the safety of the hillsides above the village. A voice speaking accented English asked for her identification and current location, then provided coordinates for a rendezvous point where she could meet people who would help her continue her journey toward freedom. Following the instructions, Sarah made her way through the mountain terrain toward the designated meeting point. The knowledge that she was no longer completely alone in hostile territory gave her strength to continue despite exhaustion and pain. Her escape was entering its final phase, with freedom now seeming achievable rather than merely hoped for. Hours later, as dawn broke over the mountains, Sarah finally spotted the signal fires that marked her rendezvous location. People emerged from concealed positions to greet her, their faces showing the same mixture of compassion and determination she had seen in the elderly woman's eyes. These mountain people had chosen to help strangers in need despite the considerable risks involved. The final leg of Sarah's journey to safety was completed with the assistance of guides who knew every path and hiding place in the region. When she finally crossed into friendly territory 3 days later, Sarah carried with her not only the satisfaction of a successful escape but also a profound appreciation for the courage and kindness of ordinary people who chose to help when help was desperately needed. Her debriefing would reveal valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions, but the most important lesson from her ordeal concerned the power of human compassion to triumph over the forces of hatred and violence. Sarah had learned that even in the darkest circumstances, there were always people willing to risk everything to help a fellow human being in need. Her survival proved that SEALs never surrender quietly, but it also demonstrated that sometimes the greatest victories come not from superior firepower, but from the simple act of one person helping another.